Angad landed in Mumbai carrying little more than $132 inside his pocket, and somewhere between immigration counters, currency exchange desks, and exhausted crowds moving beneath fluorescent lights, he slowly began understanding that the life waiting for him beyond the airport no longer existed anymore. By the time the long bus journey towards Kerala began, exhaustion had already entered his bones, and through the rain-stained window beside him, India drifted past in silence like fragments of a forgotten dream. 18 hours later, the bus finally entered Devipuram beneath a sky slowly darkening into dusk. And Angad stepped down carrying nothing except a travel bag, grief, and the unbearable uncertainty of whether the village considered him one of its own. He directly walked towards Pitamaran Thambi's house. But even before entering through the gate, he sensed something had changed. The warmth that once lived within those walls now felt distant, restrained, and wounded. Inside the house, Pitamaran spoke quietly, carefully, as though each word itself carried weight, and finally revealed what Angad had already feared deep within himself. The temple committee had locked Nanu Ashan's hut, converting the small sacred space into a storage room for temple materials, and after abandoning the unfinished murals, Devipuram no longer wished to forgive him. For several moments, Angad said nothing, because certain humiliations arrive too deep for immediate reaction. That night, he walked slowly towards the locked hut beneath the cold silence of the temple grounds, before lowering himself into the mud floor outside the doorway where his father had once lived. The temple loudspeakers began playing Venkatesha Suprabhadam before dawn, and the sacred hymn drifted across the empty courtyard with cruel indifference, as though devotion itself had moved forward without waiting for him. Hunger twisted through his stomach, yet Angad remained seated motionless outside the hut, staring towards the unfinished mural hall hidden beyond temple shadows. When dawn finally entered the village, he walked towards the temple pond, removed his clothes silently, and stepped into the freezing water, one slow movement at a time. The cold wrapped around him completely, while above him the temple gopuram stood watching through the pale morning mist. For several moments, Angad remained submerged beneath the surface, not cleansing his body, but searching desperately for something within himself that had already begun collapsing. By evening, he had made a decision. Inside a small jewelry and electronics shop in town, Angad removed his Omega watch, his iPhone, and placed them quietly upon the glass counter, while the shopkeeper studied him with a detached gaze reserved for desperate men. 20,000 rupees, that was all his former life was worth now. Angad accepted the money without argument because survival leaves very little space for pride. Later that night, he purchased a small bag, a few clothes, and 3 traditional dhotis meant as an offering for temple committee, carrying within them apology, repentance, and one final attempt at belonging. At 1:30 in the morning, he returned once again to Devipuram and sat outside the locked hut beneath the sound of insects, distant wind, and the temple bells sleeping somewhere within darkness. Before sunrise, unfamiliar voices drifted through the temple pond area, causing Angad to slowly rise from the ground. A group of non-Malayali workers walked towards the mural hall carrying plastic paint buckets, synthetic colors, and cheap brushes wrapped inside newspapers. Something inside Angad tightened instantly. He followed them silently into the temple courtyard, and the moment his eyes fell upon the sacred walls, his blood ran cold. Bright synthetic reds bled violently across ancient surfaces, Chemical yellows swallowed traditional pigments, and sacred geometry that had survived generations now stood violated beneath careless hands. For several endless seconds, Angad remained completely motionless. Then a strangled cry escaped from somewhere deep within him. Raw, involuntary, almost animal-like. The workers froze, startled by the grief erupting before them. Angad staggered towards the wall, his trembling fingers hovering above the wet synthetic paint without touching it. Because to him, this was no longer restoration, it was desecration. Moments later, fury carried him towards the committee office, where Podwal, Pishardi, and several members sat discussing festival arrangements beneath the slow rotation of ceiling fans. Without waiting for permission, Angad entered the room, clutching the folded dhotis tightly against his chest. His words collapsed into one another, apology, desperation, guilt, promises, all spilling forward while the committee listened in complete silence. Nobody interrupted him, nobody comforted him, nobody even looked directly into his eyes. Slowly, Angad lowered himself into his knees before them, extending the dhotis like offerings placed before gods who no longer wished to bless him. The silence inside the room deepened further. At 11 in the morning, committee members finally rose to leave, and Angad hurried after them through the courtyard, carrying the dhotis once again. Podwal accepted the packets briefly before turning towards an aide standing nearby. He asked the aide to distribute them among the beggars. The words struck Angad harder than violence ever could. Pishardi slowly turned towards him, disappointment hardening every syllable that followed. Days ago, we begged before you to save the temple, he said, and you abandoned us. Now you return expecting forgiveness? No. The verdict was final, absolute, merciless in its restraint. Angad was no longer welcome inside Devipuram. He stood there silently, while villagers passing through the courtyard avoided meeting his eyes. And somewhere beyond the temple walls, the unfinished goddess continued watching from beneath layers of synthetic color and fading lamp smoke. That evening, Angad walked slowly towards the Devipuram bus stop, carrying the last fragments of a life that had already collapsed around him. The bus arrived beneath fading orange light, and he climbed aboard without destination, without certainty, without even the strength to imagine what waited beyond the next morning. The town moved around him with complete indifference. Shops closing, tea stalls overflowing with conversation, traffic lights blinking through evening dust, while Angad wandered through unfamiliar streets carrying only exhaustion and shame. When hunger finally became unbearable, he entered a small roadside hotel and sat alone beneath the flickering tube light. The food arrived steaming before him, yet every mouthful tasted empty because grief had already hollowed out every remaining space within him. Night deepened slowly around the town, and with nowhere else left to go, Angad eventually lay down outside a closed shop, using his bag as a pillow beneath the sound of distant vehicles and stray dogs moving through darkness. Sometime past midnight, hurried footsteps tore through his sleep. Before he could fully rise, 3 shadows descended upon him violently, fists, knees, rage, and desperation colliding within seconds beneath the empty streetlights. Angad fought back instinctively, but exhaustion, hunger, and emotional collapse had already weakened him beyond resistance, and then suddenly they were gone, along with his bag, his money, and the final remnants of stability he still possessed. For several moments, Angad remained standing alone beneath the night sky, breathing heavily into silence. Then slowly, he reached into his trouser pocket. 15 rupees, nothing more. A broken sound escaped his throat somewhere between laughter and despair before he hurled the crumpled notes violently into the nearby bushes. For nearly 2 hours, he remained seated motionless outside the shuttered shop while dawn slowly approached through the empty streets and colorless skies. Then finally, with nowhere else left to follow, Angad stood once again and began walking. His feet carried him towards the railway station almost unconsciously, guided less by decision than by exhaustion itself. And there, waiting silently beneath the layers of smoke, rust, sweat and departure, stood a long-distance train preparing to leave the platform. The crowded compartments overflowed with laborers returning north, tired men wrapped in blankets, children sleeping against steel bars, voices speaking languages Angad could not understand. For several moments, he simply stood watching the train. Then quietly, without ticket, without destination, and without even knowing where the journey would end, Angad climbed aboard. Inside the compartment, the smell of sweat, iron and unwashed bodies pressed heavily against him, while strangers moved endlessly through narrow spaces, carrying bags, aluminium containers, and exhausted silence. A young boy, seated nearby, watched Angad curiously for several moments before finally speaking in hesitant English. "Where are you going?" Angad looked towards the darkness outside the moving train and answered with complete honesty, "I don't know." The boy smiled faintly before leaning closer through the noise of the compartment. He said, "Then you are lucky. The train is going to Kolkata."
Where stories begin.